What's up, everyone? So today's project is completely foreign to me. I've actually never changed out steering stem bearings or even the steering stem races on a frame before. So join me as I learn through the process of it all. And make sure you hang in there. I've got something really cool for you about halfway through the video. Just a quick little overview of what I'll be doing. So the top bearing slides right off, but the bottom bearing is pressed onto the stem. And I'm going to show you how you can remove that using no special tools. And then over here on the frame, the races are pressed in as well. And I'll be using a race remover to pop those out. However, it is possible to use a punch or a socket extension to remove them. This frame is freaking sexy, by the way. To see the video of me shining it up, just click the little circle right up here in the corner. So I've got the nuts and the upper bearing off the stem already. And my plan for removing the lower bearing is to cut the outer shell of the bearing where the needles sit, and that should expose a nice lip to get a grasp with a punch and knock that inner race off the stem. Now, I've never tried this before, but it should be fun figuring it out. I'm gonna pop this thing in the vise so it's a little easier to work on. All right, I've got a set of side cutters here, and hopefully that cuts through the bearing. And remember, safety first, guys. I've got it cut through the top part of the bearing. Just need to make one more snip here at the bottom. Looks like I've got it cut through both sides of the bearing. Now for the fun part. This is just what I was hoping for. There's a nice fat lip here on the race to get a hold of with a punch. I've just got a flat punch and a hammer, and I should be able to knock this thing right off. So I guess another way of removing this bearing would be to use the same punch, but wedge it in between the triple clamp and the bearing. But I would rather not chew up the triple clamp in the process. Of course, as the race is coming off, you want it to be as even as possible. So move from one side to the other, to the top, just whatever it takes to get it off evenly. As you can see, the race ended up chipping in a few spots. So I'm gonna move to the bottom of the race and use the seal as the protector for the triple clamp. So that actually worked out pretty good. I ended up with a little nick in the triple clamp though. Should be able to fix that pretty easily. All right, I am all ready to install these new bearings and races. So the triple clamp might look a little bit different. I ended up Cerakoting it. If you haven't seen that video, it is absolutely epic. Just click the circle right up here in the corner. For bearings, I've got this pivot work set. It's got both bearings, both races, and all the seals required. And then here are the tools necessary to do the job. This is a steering stem bearing installer kit. And then over here is a bearing press. So everything necessary to do the job. All this was supplied by Rocky Mountain, so huge shout out to them. Before I get started, let's take a second and pick the winner for the giveaway of this master cylinder cap. You guys crushed it on this one. 1,500 comments, that's insane. All right, so this generator is gonna pick a complete random comment from that video, and you will be the winner. Who we got? Beta KTM Rider says both 2-stroke and 4-stroke. Love your vids. All right, man or woman, whoever you are, shoot me a message here on YouTube with your shipping address, and I will get this master cylinder cap over to you. Congrats. The first step, of course, is to make sure I've got everything necessary as far as parts go. Got the 2 seals, got a bearing and a race, and another bearing and a race. Oh, and of course, you can't forget the grease. So in looking at these bearings, they both got the same part number. On this particular bike, no need to worry about differentiating the top from the bottom. And before I get started with assembling anything, I'm gonna pack these bearings full of grease. Now the goal here with packing the bearings is to have grease pouring out of each individual needle and in between the inner and outer race as well. And how I'm gonna go about this is by squirting grease on the outside of the bearing here, or you can just put grease in the palm of your hand and we're gonna work it all into the bearing. I'm just gonna go for both here. Grease in the palm and grease on the bearing. So I've got my fingers jammed inside the bearing here, and I'm just gonna work the grease all into the bearing until we have grease pouring out of every part of the bearing. The thing I like about Pivot Works is they provide you with red grease, which of course, as you guys know, is my favorite color. Remember all that grease I'd put on the bearing and in my palm? It's now somehow packed inside that bearing. You can see there's grease coming out between the two races, and as I'm spinning the bearing here, the rollers are thoroughly coated. And just for good measure, I'm gonna put a little bit more on top. Now I'm just gonna follow the same exact process on this other bearing. Pretty straightforward. All right, the lower bearing is ready to be pressed onto the triple clamp now. And of course, it would be a disaster if you forgot the seal that goes underneath the bearing. So we've got two seals here, one with a thinner lip and one with a fatter lip. So the one with the thinner lip goes over the stem and underneath the lower bearing. Just like that, with the lip facing up. And just to help the cause, I'm gonna put a little bit of grease on the stem. Since these bearings are both the same, it won't really matter which one goes on first. Just gotta make sure the taper is facing up. And right there is the farthest I can get it down by hand. Now this is where the Tusk steering stem bearing installer comes in handy. Got a few different size adapters here. Just gonna size it up and figure out which one is correct. All right, looks like the green one doesn't even fit down onto the stem. Try out the red one. That should be it. So you want the installer tool to be pressing on the inner race of the bearing. The inner race is the inner part you see on the bearing right there. So it looks like this one's good to go. Now I'll need to size up the stem with a socket. By putting a socket underneath the triple clamp on the stem here, that'll ensure the stem doesn't move at all during this process. Looks like I've got the correct one right there, 24 millimeter. Just gonna place the socket underneath the triple clamp and I'll be ready to press this bearing into place. And this is the tool that slides over the stem and makes contact with that red adapter. It is pretty straightforward, just hammering on the end of the shaft here and making sure the bearing is going on straight. I've just about got the bearing seated, and when I get to the bottom, it'll make a different sound. So at that point, time to stop. You can hear it right there. More of a solid sound to it. Like I said earlier, this is actually my first time ever installing a new lower bearing, and having this tool made it super easy. It kind of centers itself or locates itself on the stem, and then you've got the adapter, which fits perfectly with the bearing. So no need to worry about damaging the bearing or putting it on crooked. And so far the Cerakoting on the triple clamp is holding up awesome. I expected to see a little bit of silver showing through from being in contact with the socket, but I don't see any damage whatsoever. With the bottom bearing installed, it is time to pop in these new bearing races. But first, I'll need to remove the old ones. So I've got the frame all bolted down to the stand here, and I guess that means the bike is starting to go back together. Alright, to remove these old bearing races, I'll just be using a hammer along with a long 3/8 inch extension. And of course, as you're whacking on this thing, you want to make sure you're working it out evenly. Go from one side to the other. Now, if you're having trouble with removing the old races, I would recommend heating up the area with a propane torch. That'll help out quite a bit. I'm taking a look at these old races here, and they seem to be in pretty good shape. I don't see any pitting on them, but nonetheless, it's a good idea to replace them alongside the new bearings. Before the new races go in, just gonna clean up the frame with some brake cleaner and a rag here. And it never hurts to apply some grease before installation. On this bike, both races are the same, so it doesn't matter which one goes where. It is time to bust out the bearing press. Just gonna figure out which adapter I need here. Looks like that one fits pretty snug in there. Also supplied in the kit is this handle to get the bearing race started and straight. Looks like the race is going in pretty straight. Just gonna get this collet back into place. And now I've got the actual press part of the tool. This is the handle that goes up top and the shaft that slides through the neck of the frame. It's pretty slick. The shaft has a quick release button to adjust the depth. And now I'm gonna slide the shaft through the neck of the frame and install the handle up top. I'll need to move this thing up a few notches. Right about there looks good. Whether you're pressing in the top race or the bottom race, you always want to have the handle on top of the frame. Just making sure I got everything all lined up here. And so tightening down the handle will press that race down inside the frame. As the race is being pressed in, you should be able to feel when it bottoms out. And it's definitely important to have that race seated all the way. And then pressing the quick release on the bottom will release this whole assembly from the frame. Like I said earlier, it's super important for the race to be seated all the way in the frame. Make sure there's no gap underneath it. And if you applied any grease, you'll be able to see it squeezing out once that race is seated all the way. Now the process for the bottom race is going to be slightly different. Here I've got the race, going to get it into place, and then I've got the handle with the collet on it, just to get things started. Things are looking good with the race, so I'm gonna pop the collet off the handle and grab the press tools. All right, what'll be different this time around is I'll be putting the collet on the bottom side instead of the top, sliding the shaft through the frame with the handle on, and then putting the quick release on the bottom side. And like I said earlier, you always want to have the handle of the tool up on top of the frame. Just got to make sure I got this quick release locked into place. There it is. And then I can tighten the handle up top. Just going to keep twisting until I feel it bottom out. It feels like it stopped right there, so I'm going to pull this apart and make sure that race is seated all the way. Since the bottom race is a little tougher to see, I've got a 90-degree pick here Just gonna run it up inside and make sure there's no gap all the way around. All right, we're all set. Races are all pressed in. Man, having this press tool was definitely a lifesaver. I don't know if I would have been able to get these races in straight otherwise. What I'm excited about now is installing these triple clamps and seeing how the bronze goes with the aluminum. But before I slide the triple clamp in, I'm gonna dab some more grease onto these races and bearings. I've always preferred setting up the top bearing, seal, and the nut. That way I'm not trying to scrounge for parts as the triple clamp's already in. Now it's a pretty simple deal from here on out. Now to tighten down this nut, I've got a spanner wrench which will take care of that. Since I can't set the steering head tension without the front end completely together, I'm just going to tighten down this nut until it's somewhat snug. Man, those new bearings and fresh grease make it so smooth. Alright, right about there feels good. It's got some tension, but it's definitely not loose to the point where it's sloppy. Time to top it off with the upper triple clamp. This should look amazing. Now I'm going to top it off with a washer and this trick little anodized nut that I snagged from Rocky Mountain. Actually, before I throw that nut on, I know these threads corrode pretty easily, so I'm going to use some anti-seize lubricant. Just going to cinch down the nut with a steering stem wrench. And just like the lower nut, can't give it a final tighten until the front end is all together. These wrenches are super handy to have. It's got a 32mm on one side and a 30mm on the other. So it'll work on pretty much any bike out there, as well as most rear axles too. And I know someone out there could really put one of these wrenches to use. So I am gonna hook you up. All you have to do is comment down below what your dream motorcycle is. It could be anything. Then I'm gonna go through and pick one of your comments at random and have Rocky Mountain ship you one of these wrenches. Good luck, everyone. Oh man, that looks so rad. I love the bronze look with the red. I cannot wait to put this bike together some more. The next video will be on doing some really cool things with the brakes, so stay tuned. You guys know the deal by now. All the parts and tools I use throughout the video are linked down below. So that way you're not on a wild goose chase looking for stuff. Alright, thank you so much for watching everyone, and I will see you around.